Let's talk about player-generated content in massively multiplayer online spaces. This is an interesting topic because it is not a topic. Even though people want to put player-generated content in a box, it is actually hundreds of different things, and there are thousands of different structures to use it and facilitate it. So let's talk a little bit about those instead. Let's talk about the structures behind player-generated content. How do we actually use it? How do we actually make it not bad? Why do we want to talk about this? Well, I recently had the misfortune of watching Shawn Murray's most recent pitch. If you're not aware, he's the guy that pitched No Man's Sky. Now, No Man's Sky is considered a redemption story at this point because his team spent years turning it into a playable game. Whether or not No Man's Sky is redeemed, Shawn Murray isn't. His overpromises never came to anything, and they were clearly overpromises. And guess what? Now he's back for Light No Fire, a game he's been working on for 5 years. Stop me if you've heard this pitch before. It's a massively multiplayer online RPG, full loot PvP in a shared world where you can build anything together or against each other, compete and explore or cooperate and delve into industry, and you can fight and you can do whatever you want and you can do anything you want. You can be in this world, in this realistic world, and oh, you have heard that before? Oh, you've heard it hundreds of times before. Oh, every other Kickstarter about an MMO was that pitch? How did those work out? Oh. There is this weird obsession with creating shared worlds that change as the players do stuff in them. It's this thing that comes up over and over. It's strange how popular this idea is, and it never works out. Because there's no structure to the player-generated content. It is a place, not a game. And that's true of Shawn Murray as well. He's a place. No, I mean that he's a tool maker. He likes making tools, but he keeps pitching them as games. A game needs a design. A game needs structure to make sure the players are doing enjoyable things. And these games don't really work out because the players don't have a lot of enjoyable things to do. They don't need advanced procedural content to exist. It's not that they're hard to make. These get made all the time. There's dozens of them. Worm Online exists. It got made. But it's not a very popular game because the structure behind it doesn't facilitate a lot of kinds of play. It's pretty limited. It works in however it happens to work when they throw it together, and the design is basically just, whatever, man. Do whatever you want. That's our design. It's not how software works. In order to do something in software, the software has to allow you to do it. So do whatever you want only works if you have made it possible to do whatever you want. Let's talk about some similar games that do work and have the same pitch. Let's talk about Eco. Not the dolphin, that's Echo. Eco is the same pitch. It's a giant shared world where dozens or hundreds of people can get together and they can industrialize and they can compete and cooperate and explore and they can work together or fight or whatever else they want to do, right? The difference is that Eco ends. See, the trick here is that as you industrialize, you're burning the world down. The ecosystem, hence the name, is dying. And the idea is that you will notice that, and all of the players will band together to create a society that protects the world. And they may even enforce penalties via PvP on players that refuse to follow those rules and, threaten the commons. But here's the thing about Eco. Whether you end up burning the world down and everybody dies, or whether you reach the end and succeed and take off in your magic rocket ship, the game ends. Because Eco understands that this is a limited resource. A world that the players can edit is a limited resource that runs out, and eventually you reach a steady state, and that is not what a game is about. So you just end at that point. Eco also understands that latecomers and slow players are at a significant disadvantage, which is why Eco strongly recommends that you get your group together for a launch on day one. Everybody plays, starting from the same point. And there are things in place to make sure that if you play 20 hours a day, you don't get too far ahead of the people who only play 1 or 2. It's a very carefully designed game. And there are other MMOs that do this. They allow players to create content on a shared world, and then they just hit reset every season or so. Hell, Star Citizen does that. They understand that the end game doesn't exist here. There's no end game stuff to do. The game is over. So once the world is done, Eco ends. Once you have all of the spaceships in Star Citizen resets. Player-generated content is used by literally every MMO because otherwise they're wasting their MM. If you got players, massively multiplayer, in fact, you're going to want to use that to create content. Even just 1 versus 1 games use player-generated content. Street Fighter, full of player-generated content, because what do you think a match is? It's player-generated content. You might not consider it that because I might be defining it differently than you are, but it is a match between 2 players where stuff happens and it is fun for the people involved. I would call that content. So there are a lot of kinds of content, and that can include PvP. Probably the most significant example of this would be EVE Online. People like to discuss EVE Online as a shining example of player-generated content, player-driven game world. Everything in EVE is player-created, so how can you say that this doesn't work? Because EVE Online has very strict regulations, very strict paths that players can follow, and all of those paths are about facilitating PvP. All of the player-generated stuff in EVE is built to funnel into a PvP system. EVE's strength is that the designers really understood PvP, not that the designers really understood player-generated content. EVE Online's player-generated content is a conflict system, not a content system. Here's an example. You make a corporation. Cool. That immediately puts you in conflict with hundreds of other corporations, and the best thing about that is that this is async PvP. And this is one of the most genius things about EVE. They have a lot of systems for asynchronous multiplayer behavior, both PvP and coordinating to do PvP better. So if there is a drought in players, if the player base drops off and there's an hour where only 3 people are logged in, you can still run your corporation because you're running it against players that are offline. A lot of stuff in EVE happens when other players are offline or when you're offline. It's massively asynchronous PvP. Obviously, there's also actual synchronous PvP with fights and stuff, but it's the asynchronous stuff that lets EVE continue after those bumps, after those moments where people stop logging in for a few hours or there's a dip in subscribers. If everything is synchronous, then you need to always have players, plenty of players. But if you allow for asynchronous PvP, then if there's not enough players, you just fight the players that were on last night or last week or last month. That is the power of EVE. EVE is a PvP game, not a player-generated content game, and that is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's very well structured. I really admire the designers who put EVE together. They clearly know how PvP should work. Unlike all the people who are promising full loot PvP, open world games who don't seem to understand that stuff needs to actually be designed. Let's talk about some more common examples. Like, let's talk about a more ordinary, massively multiplayer online RPG. A lot of them have more or less the same bones, so we'll pick one I'm familiar with, which is FFXIV. FFXIV is a Final Fantasy game, and it is pretty much a normal, massively multiplayer RPG. There's really nothing particularly amazing about it. It doesn't like have any design standouts that make your jaw drop. But it has a large number of player-generated content systems, because all MMOs do. It's got a market board, which obviously is players selling to players. It's got, cooperative and competitive team play, which should be obvious, right? It's got FCs, which are basically guilds. It's got housing. It's got glam. It's got a lot of that kind of stuff where the players are doing content, whether that content is momentary, like fighting against some god somewhere as part of a team, or whether it's more permanent, like creating a house and decorating it. All of these things exist, and I'm sure there are plenty of others that I kind of just glossed over a little bit, like AFKing and Limsa. But all of these are forms of content, and they are all quite structured. Even AFKing and Limsa is structured. Because the team understands that these are things that allow players to interact with other players, so they need to have structures to make that interaction good. That interaction needs to survive low player counts, it needs to survive griefers, it needs to survive endgame play. It needs to be able to function at all times and always make other players' lives better, or at least more interesting. For example, the market. How does the market work? In every modern, massively multiplayer RPG, the player-to-player market is an asynchronous market. Gone are the days where you would get an alt to sit out in a city somewhere hawking whatever you were trying to sell. That didn't work out, because it was too dependent on players actually wanting to play as a marketing guy, and nobody wants to actually do that. So instead, nowadays, there is a method of putting it up on a market board, and then it can keep selling even when you're offline. That is universal. There are also universal things for preventing dupes, for making sure that the listings happen in specific orders, for preventing griefers or preventing fraud. But there's also a lot of things for how do we deal with bots? How many bots are acceptable? What kinds of things are easy for bots to get? And does that make our lives easier? An easy example of that would be crafting crystals. In FFXIV, crafting crystals are needed for all the crafting you ever do. You can gather them yourself. But if you had no bots, these would be enormously expensive. Like, more expensive than buying full sets of gear. However, because these are things that bots can mine, the prices are generally quite affordable. The bots are actually making the world better for crafter players. There's also things like, how do these shard? Does each world have a different marketplace? What happens if you trade a good from one world to another world and then repost it on that marketplace? How do you survive, that kind of market transactions? Does that make the world better or worse? How about mods? Nearly every successful MMO RPG has mods attached to it. How do mods affect the marketplace? Well, in Final Fantasy XIV, mods let you try and compare the marketplaces. Whether you're talking about in-game mods or whether you're talking about websites that track all of this, they let you track down where things are cheap and where things are expensive. And if you are obsessed with Gil, you can take advantage. Gil is the cash. You can take advantage of those mods and make some money. But in the process, what you're doing is you're delivering goods that were cheap in one place to a place where they're expensive and making them less expensive in the expensive place, which makes everybody's life better. That's like idealized market behavior, right? Then you've got stuff like housing. How does housing make everybody's life better? Well, people don't generally wander around looking at houses. And even if they do, there's not a lot of content to appreciate in a house. You can appreciate it for its beauty or its cleverness, but it's not like there's a quest in there or, some way to make money or, get better glams or whatever. It's just a place. But this place is where you organize a lot of your social stuff. Having a place allows you to put together social behavior for your own friends and your own team. And the guild has a house, right? And we decorate that house for the guild's needs. So in our case, the outside of the guild, the yard of the guild, is full of practice gear, which is pretty uncommon. But the reason we do that is because that's where our raiders go before their raid starts. And they all want to, warm up. So you put in a lot of practice gear so they can warm up before their raid starts. And they go do a, level 90 savage or whatever, and they're warmed up. But most FCs, most guilds, don't have that kind of hardcore raider presence, so they don't do that. They decorate it with other things in mind. On the other hand, our interior is built for events. Not like role-playing events, but things like contests, because those are the other kinds of things we run. So even though the housing has no direct in-world usefulness, it's not like people go to houses for fun, they make each player want to create more social contact. You want to use your house. You say, oh, well, those people over there, they throw a dance party. I bet I could throw a dance party. All I need to do is decorate the house to be a dance thingy, Oh, look at them. They made 200,000 gil an hour bartending at a fake cafe. I can do that. I'll put together a cafe. So the housing facilitates an enormous amount of player-generated content. And it doesn't really have any problems with stuff like griefing because it's not a place players go just at random. It's a place you get invited to. How about mods? Well, again, the mods really only add to this. The mods related to housing are usually arranging your house faster and easier, so you can decorate it better. Obviously, there are some other mods as well, but there's not really very many exploitative mods that I've seen related to housing. We can go down the list because all of these things have more or less the same answers, right? They all facilitate better interactions with other players, whether directly or indirectly. They're all structured very carefully so that players can get a better experience because of what other players are doing. That's the frickin' point. And that's why Final Fantasy XIV is still alive, even after so many false starts and so many, dearths where nobody was playing or, it was a weak game for a while. It's still around because of all of the player-generated content in these structures. It's not just, oh, look, Final Fantasy XIV is full of player-generated content. No, it's look at all of these structures that facilitate the content and use it. There's nothing special about Final Fantasy XIV with this. This is thoroughly normal. Most successful MMOs have the same approach on all of these things. It's hardly unique, but every single one of those things is carefully thought out because it's players affecting other players, and you need to understand how that works when there are griefers, when there's endgame, when there's no other players online. You need to think about how that is facilitated, how that is used, how that is directed. You need to design your game. Let's talk about some that aren't games. SecondLife. Ooh, this one is an interesting one. If you've never heard of SecondLife, stop watching this video and go investigate SecondLife for a while. It is quite old at this point, but I think it's still online. It's basically a big virtual chat room. But the thing is that you can own land and build whatever you want on that land. So it's a virtual chat room with an actual, world that you can wander around in, and it's full of people's stuff. Now, when you hear a full loot PvP MMORPG in a realistic world say, you can do whatever you want, the reason that whenever we ape that A lot of us online have a distinct distaste for that line. The reason we think that is such a dumbass line is because we've seen Second Life, where you can literally do whatever you want. The game is built with that in mind. The game actually has the chops to make that possible. You can build anything. You can do pretty much anything. Now, obviously, that means the world is a weird dreamscape full of just nonsense. You're not going to see New York. You're going to see just the most bizarre, dreamlike structures that don't make any sense. And most of those structures are going to be empty. There's not going to be any players in them. But they can be anything. They can contain games. They can do fun things. They can give you new glams that player just decided to create. They can sell you a car for fake money that doesn't really have any meaning. So Second Life is still around, not because it was designed well, but because it was designed intentionally. I don't think they did a very good job designing it, but they clearly thought about it. And they put together a tool that allows you to create stuff, whatever you want to create. A house, a dress, a car, go ahead, whatever you want. Now, this works because there is no progression, no meaningful progression in Second Life. Second Life is not an MMORPG. It's not even an MMOG. It's just an MMO. There's no game here. If there is a game, it's playing something someone else created. And that's interesting. I haven't drawn anything for this because it's not something I can draw, right? That's interesting because I think that the concept of a progression is actually what makes it not work in a lot of other games. Because if you have a progression, then you have an end state. You have a situation where you have it all. You've finished the game, but the game thinks that you're going to want to come back and keep playing. In Second Life, that's not a huge issue because even if you create the house you wanted to create or the car you wanted to create, tomorrow you'll be like, oh, I watched Blade Runner yesterday. I wonder if I could make like the Blade Runner car. You'll be inspired to create something new, and there's no progression required to do that. You can just go do it. This is what a sandbox looks like. It looks like a weird dreamscape, and that's fine. Now, I think a new game that's Second Life-like is probably inevitable, but it's a little bit hard to design it because it doesn't have any built-in progression or gameplay, and that's really a little difficult to sell people on. Everybody wants to hear that pitch about that open PvP, full loot, whatever. And for some reason, nobody wants to hear, yeah, you can build a house if you want, or not if you don't. You want to make a car, you can make a car. But another big problem with Second Life that only works because Second Life isn't very successful is you have to police this shit. It would be pretty trivial to use Second Life for illegal activities. And even if it's not illegal activities, it would be pretty easy to use Second Life for activities that actively make the game worse. And you have to constantly stay on top of that. Even Second Life, I'm sure, has to constantly stay on top of that. And they're fairly small. If they were, if someone found out like, oh, someone's been playing Disney movies in a Second Life cafe or something, it might get Disney angry enough to investigate, at which point Second Life would be just shit out of luck because there are billions and billions of copyright infringing things in Second Life, since you can literally just import images. It's not that Second Life is built on those things. It's just that those things exist because you can have anything exist and everything is copyrighted by Disney specifically. So it's difficult to sort of find a sweet spot where players can generate things, but you're not going to get in trouble for that. And I think one of the ways you can get around that is by not being an MMO, but I'm not going to talk about that today. We're going to instead talk about a different MMO, Roblox. Similar to Second Life, Roblox doesn't really have a strong progression to it. There's no shared universe. It's just a shared list of random stuff, and you can make your own random stuff. And that works. It works fine. It works great. Roblox is a trillionaire company that is hilariously abusive, just because people can do whatever they want and children want to make stuff for other children. That is, I want to say, the game. The design of the game is fine. We won't go into details about the company here. I'm not a fan of them. But the design of the game is fine. And again, this works because there really isn't very much progression. It's not hampered by the idea that you need to play the game to do a specific thing. Like, oh, you need to survive. No, you don't. Oh, you need to build a house. No, you don't. Oh, you need to do PvP. No, you don't. You can do those things, but you don't have to. You can do whatever you want because Roblox built an engine which actually allows you to do whatever you want. That requires the software to enable it, and then it requires the structure behind that software to let you do it without being incredibly destructive. Now, Roblox is incredibly destructive. We're not going to talk about that, though. We're going to move on. Let's talk about the last thing I really wanted to hammer home, and that's Endgame. One of the worst parts of a game that is player content driven is the end game. Because at some point, you run out of resources. Whether that's you've conquered the entire world, or whether that's you're out of levels to gain, at some point, you reach the end of the game. What are you doing? What are you going to do now that you're out of stuff to do? You're going to call the cops and have them drive past the house. All right, I'm back. So, Endgame, you're going to want to create a structure to funnel those endgame players into making life better for other players. How do you do that? Well, here's the thing. Endgame players, they have all the money. They have all the resources. They literally don't need any more stuff. They've gone through all of your systems, and they're done. They've accrued all there is to accrue. But early game players haven't. Oh, well, this seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? Yeah. In fact, you can just do this. Which seems like a simplification, right? But let me go ahead and talk about some structures that can allow that to happen. And these are all player-created structures. They're not even built into the game. Obviously, there are things like mentors and stuff, but I'm talking about more concrete stuff. For example, if you run a glam contest, or a picture hunt, or some kind of competition, you're going to have a reward, usually in-game money. That reward comes from players who have too much money and don't care. So they'll give their money away because it's fun to do an event. It's fun to have a glam contest. It's fun to look at pictures and try and figure out what part of the game they're from. It's fun to look at art. You have an art contest. The people who participate either do need the money or are thinking the same thing, and they're also endgame players, and the money isn't really a big draw for them, but hey, if they get that money, they'll just pump it right back into the next contest because they don't need it either, but it was a lot of fun to have a contest. So the money changes hands, and even if it doesn't go to early game players, it still goes to facilitating more fun for other players and facilitating more contests. This is something that is extremely easy to do if you have a foundation for it, and Final Fantasy XIV certainly does. There's tons of these, happens all the time. You just go to look at Party Finder, and most of the Party Finder stuff is people advertising their events, which almost always have in-game gil prizes, cash prizes. There's nothing wrong with that. That is great. Congratulations, the endgame players are actually making the game better for every kind of other player, whether they're new game or mid game or other late game players. Everybody is having more fun because these end game players are allowed to put those resources towards whatever events they want in whatever quantity they want. This is do whatever you want gameplay, although it's limited to social things. When a game says that they want to let you do whatever you want right from the beginning, that's a sign of danger because it's very hard to let someone do whatever they want while they're in danger, while they're trying to progress. That kind of implies you don't understand what your game is about, because your game is about progressing, right? So if you can do whatever you want, how do you progress unless you're doing the things the game wants you to, right? But if you're at the end game, you really can do whatever you want because you've already done all the stuff the game wanted you to do. And a big part of what you need to design is what those people can do. How do they use their massive amount of money, massive amount of resources in general, to help make new experiences, make more fun experiences for other players? Here's an easy example, right? There's a game out there, there's a couple of games out there that allow you to create player-created scenarios. An example of this would be Stormworks. Stormworks, not Star Wars, Stormworks, is a single player, largely single player. I think it's technically multiplayer, but it's kind of buggy. But you build vehicles in Stormworks, and you can drive them around, and you can get vehicles from other players by going to the online, share spot and play with their vehicles and just have some fun. But here's the thing. Stormworks also lets you make arbitrarily complicated scenarios. And this is common in a lot of more or less single player games. You can do Solasta, Crown of the Magister. Same thing. Players can make their own scenarios, their own maps, and have other players go through them. But since these games don't have any significant, persistent progression to worry about, those scenarios are basically freeform. You just do them because you feel like doing them, right? It's not like they're going to change your long-term level or whatever. But in an MMO, we could do the same thing. There are some dangers because it's content that would need to be moderated. But we could do the same thing. We could let players create scenarios and let other players run through them. But an MMO has a progression system, right? So how do you make that work? Because if a player can make a scenario and there's progression in the scenario, then they could just make a scenario that progresses everybody as far as they want, whenever they want, right? You have to come up with some kind of rule. It's like, well, yeah, how about we make that an endgame thing? Oh, that scenario you're creating. Does that scenario hand out cash because of, monster drops or whatever? Well, in that case, whoever created it simply puts up the cash. They have plenty of cash, so they can do that. Oh, does it give you XP because of monsters in there? Well, guess what? This player, why not? Literally spend your XP. Oh, were you a level 90 warrior and that's the cap? Just spend it. Spend it, spend it, spend it. I want to take that warrior down to level 15 and level him from scratch. How do I do that? Well, I could restart, create an alt, or I could literally spend my experience points and put them into a scenario so other players can benefit. I can give out my own XP as a reward. Why not? There are so many spaces where player-generated content can work. There are so many structures left to be discovered. And all I'm asking is people put some thought into how they're designing their games. Don't simply pitch a place and pretend that it is a game. Don't pitch a tool and pretend that it is a game. Put some thought into how players will affect other players. Put some thought into how the end game works. Put some thoughts into how your game persists even with a low player count. Try and figure out how your game functions and design it. Because that's the fun part of game design. That's it.